They said it was just a misunderstanding. But how would you feel if your own parents sent out wedding invitations that said true family only, and your name wasn't there? I didn't text. I didn't beg for a seat. I showed up anyway, sat in the back, and watched my father toast to blood that can't be replaced. Then the $25,000 bill came back declined, and suddenly the man who'd erased me from the family list was standing in front of me asking for help. I'm Lauren Bennett, and this is how the uninvited guest became the only one who paid the price. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The rain had already started by the time I woke up, a soft Seattle drizzle tapping against my window like it had something to say. My apartment smelled like coffee and eucalyptus. Every plant on the sill was thriving, unlike most relationships I'd ever had. Order, control, balance. That's what I built my life around. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a design proposal for a tech client downtown when my phone buzzed. Aunt Claire's name flashed on the screen. It wasn't unusual for her to text, but something about it made my stomach tighten. Lauren, you need to know the message read. Madison's wedding is this weekend in Newport. They said it's only for true family. They didn't send you an invitation. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. For a second I thought maybe I was misreading it, but then she sent a photo of the invitation. Cream paper gold edges, elegant calligraphy, a celebration of true family and love. My chest tightened. The words looked harmless enough, but to me, they might as well have been a verdict. I leaned back in my chair, exhaled slowly. It wasn't like I hadn't expected this. My parents, Richard and Evelyn Bennett, had perfected the art of selective belonging years ago. I was the adopted one, the child they showcased when it looked good for their image, the proof of their generosity, the prop in their perfect family narrative. Still seeing those words in print, true family, hit differently. The espresso machine hissed as I stood and walked to the kitchen. I poured a shot of coffee, the bitter smell cutting through the rain. My reflection in the glass door looked calm, but my pulse betrayed me. I'd spent so many years building a life that couldn't be touched by them. Yet one text from Claire could unravel it in seconds. I opened the old wooden box I kept tucked under a shelf. Inside were small pieces of a past I rarely visited. A photo from the day I was adopted, newspaper clippings about the Bennett's charity work, a Christmas card that just said, "Love, Dad and Mom," with no handwritten note. In the photo, I looked shy, but hopeful. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. Evelyn's hand rested on my shoulder like she was afraid to smudge her dress. The rain thickened outside. Drops slid down the window, distorting the skyline. My phone rang again. Aunt Claire. I answered. Lauren. Her voice came through soft, hesitant. I know you didn't need to hear it from me, but I couldn't let you find out some other way. It's okay, I said quietly. It's not okay, she replied. You have every right to be there. You're his daughter, too. I laughed once, dry and short. Am I, though I'm the one they keep out of family photos? The one who stopped existing after Madison was born? Don't say that. I'm not angry, Aunt Claire. I'm just tired of pretending it's ever going to be different. She paused. I could hear the rain on her end, too faint and steady. You should come, she said finally. Not for them. For yourself. So you can see it all clearly. For a long moment, I didn't answer. My mind flashed to the last time I'd spoken to my father almost 3 years ago, when he'd told me I was too emotional about family matters and should focus on my career. I'd poured everything into my design firm, my name, my time, my heart, and it paid off. I was successful, self-sufficient, exactly what they said I couldn't be. And yet, deep down, some part of me still wanted to be seen. I'll think about it, I said. Promise me you'll think with your heart. Not your pride, Claire said. I smiled faintly. My pride's been the only thing keeping me standing, Aunt Claire. You sound just like your mother. That last line landed softly like a stone dropped in water. My birth mother had died when I was a teenager. Claire was her sister, the only family I had left who treated me like I was more than an obligation. After we hung up, I sat there for a while listening to the sound of the rain and the hum of the espresso machine. Eventually I stood, walked to the window, and stared down at the city. Gray, wet, alive. I took another look at the photo from that adoption day, then slid it back into the box and closed the lid. The decision came quietly, without drama. I was going to the wedding. Not because they deserved it, not because I wanted to be forgiven or included, but because I was done running from the ghosts that wore my last name. Outside, the clouds were breaking. A thin shaft of light cut through the gray and hit the edge of my desk. I took a sip of my coffee, lukewarm now, and said to the empty room, "Not for them, for me." And for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a lie. By the time I crossed the Washington border into Oregon, the rain had thinned to mist. The highway hugged the coastline, gray waves rolling against dark rocks, the kind of scenery that could make you feel both infinite and small. The radio was playing something soft. Fleetwood Mac, I think, and the steady rhythm matched the hum in my chest. Driving always helped me think. It was the only place I didn't have to talk, explain, or pretend. The wipers squeaked across the glass as I glanced at the passenger seat. My sketchbook sat open, a rough floor plan half drawn, the kind of mindless design I did when my thoughts needed somewhere to go. The words on Aunt Claire's text replayed in my head, "True family." The phrase clawed at me, dragging up memories I'd buried under years of success and silence. I used to think I'd won the lottery when the Bennetts chose me. Back in 2010, I was 19, recently orphaned after my mother's cancer battle. I'd been drifting between foster homes when a social worker said a prominent couple wanted to meet me. I still remember walking into their glass-walled mansion in Newport, how it smelled of lemon polish and something expensive I couldn't name. Evelyn Bennett looked perfect even then. Her makeup didn't move when she smiled. Richard shook my hand like he was greeting a client. They told me they wanted to give me stability. I wanted to believe them. A month later, a photographer came to take pictures for the Orange County Register. The article headline read, "The Bennetts open their hearts and home to a child in need." I was in the center wearing a dress Evelyn picked out. My smile careful, unsure. Richard had his arm around me for the photo, but the second the camera clicked off, he stepped away like he'd touched something fragile. For a while they tried. Dinners together, polite conversation. Evelyn bought me books about etiquette and posture. Richard asked about my grades, but never listened to the answers. I was an accessory to their goodness, a walking PR statement. Then Madison was born. Everything changed after that. The nursery Evelyn designed for her was twice the size of my bedroom. Reporters came again this time to celebrate the growing Bennett family. I wasn't in the photo. They didn't introduce me as their daughter anymore, just Lauren, the young woman we helped years ago. That subtle shift cut deeper than anything else. There was one night, I'll never forget it. I was 22, sitting at the dinner table after getting a scholarship offer from an art institute in Portland. I told them the news, hoping maybe finally they'd be proud. Richard didn't look up from his phone. "You should be grateful for what you already have," he said. "Not everyone gets to live here." That was the last time I called him Dad. The memories stung more than I wanted to admit. I turned up the radio to drown them out, but every lyric seemed to know too much. After another hour on the road, the fog thickened, swallowing the edges of the highway. I pulled into a rest stop overlooking the ocean. The parking lot was empty except for a single RV and a vending machine that buzzed like a dying bee. I killed the engine, letting the silence rush in. The sea stretched below. Gray, restless, endless. I leaned forward, resting my forehead on the steering wheel, and let the ache wash through me. I used to think if I'd just worked hard enough, earned enough, became enough, they'd finally see me as part of the family. But they never would. I wasn't their daughter. I was their redemption story. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked older than I remembered. The eyes were the same, though. My mother's eyes, Aunt Claire always said. I reached into the glove box and pulled out my leather-bound notebook, the one I carried everywhere. On the first blank page, I wrote, "They never saw me as one of them, but I don't need them to define my worth anymore." I stared at the sentence until the words steadied my breathing. Then I added one more line beneath it. "I'm going to the wedding to look back, not to be accepted." Closing the book, I leaned back in my seat and let the rain return. For a moment, I imagined my mother sitting beside me, her hand resting on mine, that same gentle calm she always carried. "You belong somewhere. You feel free," she once told me when I was little. I didn't understand it then, but I think I finally did now. I started the engine, merging back onto Highway 101. The road curved south, winding between cliffs and mist. The song on the radio shifted to Tom Petty. "You belong somewhere, you feel free." I smiled for the first time that day, a quiet, private smile that no one else would see. Whatever waited for me in Newport, awkward smiles, fake toasts, carefully measured cruelty, I'd face it on my own terms. The sea followed beside me like a companion, gray and endless, until the road disappeared into fog, and all that was left was the hum of the tires and the steady sound of my heartbeat keeping time. The closer I got to Newport Beach, the more the world began to sparkle, in that artificial Southern California way. Clean cars, manicured palms, sun-glazed wealth, pretending to be effortless. The Solana Resort rose from the cliffs like glass and white stone had been sculpted by the ocean itself. It was the kind of place where people whispered instead of talking, where everything from the smell of salt to the sound of jazz was perfectly controlled. I parked my rental car beside a row of black Range Rovers and Teslas. For a moment, I just sat there, watching the Pacific shimmer through the windshield. My palms were slick. The air smelled of salt and sunscreen. I told myself I wasn't nervous, just aware. I had faced worse than awkward smiles and polite cruelty. Inside the lobby glowed with light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows. Staff in white uniforms moved silently across the marble floor. At the reception desk, a woman smiled in the way people do when they're trained to make you feel both welcome and evaluated. "Good afternoon," she said. "Are you checking in for the Bennett event?" "Yes," I replied. "Lauren Bennett." Her fingers hovered over the tablet screen, then paused. Her smile dimmed slightly. "I'm sorry, Ms. Bennett. I don't see your name listed on the guest registry. I wasn't surprised, but it still stung." "That's all right," I said calmly. "I'm just here to offer my congratulations. You can let them know Lauren Bennett is here." The name hit her like static. She looked up quickly, eyes widening. "Of course," she said, her voice softening, almost nervous. "Yes, of course. Please, right this way." Money and reputation always had a way of unlocking doors, even when those doors weren't meant for you. She led me through the glass corridor that opened into the pre-wedding reception. Music floated from a jazz trio in the corner. Upright bass, brushed drums, a lazy trumpet that made the whole place feel like a movie set. Guests moved in groups, laughter soft and practiced. Women in silk dresses, men in linen suits, each holding a glass of champagne that cost more than a week's rent in Seattle. I spotted Evelyn first. Her silver hair gleamed under the chandeliers, every strand arranged like it had been planned weeks in advance. She was surrounded by a small circle of donors and foundation members. Her voice smooth, authoritative the way people talk when they know everyone's watching. When she turned and saw me, her expression faltered. For a fraction of a second, she looked startled. Then her face rearranged itself into the kind of politeness reserved for strangers. "Lauren," she said, her tone caught between surprise and reprimand. "You're here." I smiled gently. "Hi, Mom. You look beautiful." It took her a beat too long to answer. "Thank you," she said, finally regaining composure. "I didn't realize you'd be joining us. This is more of a private gathering for close family and friends. Of course," I said, keeping my voice even. "I just wanted to stop by to wish Madison well. And to see how you and Dad were doing." Her lips twitched at the word Dad, but before she could reply, I felt a shadow at my shoulder. Richard Bennett, tall, crisp, in a tailored navy suit, carrying the kind of confidence that could pass for charm until you looked too closely. He placed a hand on Evelyn's back and smiled at me like a man greeting a distant acquaintance. "Lauren," he said smoothly, "didn't expect to see you here. This event is for family only, but feel free to sit for a bit." His tone was light, almost kind, but the undercurrent was clear. "You don't belong here." My heart gave one hard beat, but my face didn't change. "Thank you," I said. "I won't stay long." He nodded once and turned away before I finished speaking. Evelyn followed, already back in performance mode, laughing at something a board member said. A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne flutes. I took one more for the armor than the taste. The bubbles fizzed against my lips, sharp and cold. I scanned the room, searching for Aunt Claire. When I found her near the back, she caught my eye and subtly motioned for me to stay calm. Her expression was equal parts warning and pride. A small group of guests nearby whispered. One woman in pearls asked Evelyn softly, "Who's the young woman by the bar?" Evelyn smiled thinly, lowering her voice just enough. "Oh, that's Lauren, our adopted daughter. We haven't seen her in years." The sweetness in her tone was almost worse than open disdain. I felt every muscle in my body tighten, but I forced myself to stay still. I smiled politely at a passing couple who gave me a quick, curious glance. On the outside, I looked like another well-dressed guest enjoying a glass of champagne. Inside, I could feel the old ache twisting the one that never really left, no matter how far I moved from Newport. I wandered to the edge of the terrace. The view was breathtaking. Waves crashing against rocks, the horizon melting into gold. Behind me, laughter and glasses clinking continued, as if nothing had changed, as if I hadn't just been reduced to a footnote in the story they'd built without me. For a brief second, I thought about leaving. I could drive back to Seattle that night, tell Aunt Claire she'd been right about not reopening old wounds. But then, I saw Madison across the room, her dark hair tucked behind one ear, her smile radiant as she greeted guests. She looked genuinely happy, and for the first time that day, I felt something other than resentment. I stayed where I was, the ocean breeze tangling my hair. Maybe this was why I came, to stand in the middle of their world and realize I didn't need it anymore. Aunt Claire came up beside me quietly, holding her own glass of water. "You're doing fine," she whispered. "Just breathe. You don't owe anyone a scene." I nodded, eyes still on the waves. "Don't worry," I said. "They'll never see me break again." Behind us, the band shifted to something slower, smoother. I took another sip, the sting of the champagne fading. I told myself I'd stay just a little longer, long enough to remember exactly who these people were. Then I'd walk away on my own terms. The ceremony started just as the sun began to sink behind the Pacific. Rows of white chairs lined the cliffside lawn, of the Solana resort ribbons fluttering in the breeze. The air smelled faintly of salt and peonies. Everything looked perfect. The kind of curated perfection my parents built their lives around. I sat in the last row, half hidden behind a pillar of flowers. From where I was, I could see Madison standing at the altar, radiant in lace and sunlight. Her dress caught the wind like it had wings. For a second, I forgot the years between us, the silence, the awkward phone calls. She looked happy, and I wanted that happiness for her. Pastor Miller's voice carried softly through the microphone, gentle and practiced. "We gather here today to celebrate love and the joining of two families." He smiled at Madison and Noah as they exchanged nervous glances. The crowd responded with polite laughter. Cameras clicked, champagne glasses clinked from nearby tables. When the ceremony ended and applause filled the air, the pastor invited everyone to the reception area for a toast. I hesitated, then followed the stream of guests across the lawn to the terrace, where a long, elegant bar gleamed under the amber lights. The ocean stretched endlessly beyond the glass railings, waves breaking in rhythm. I stood near the back as the waitstaff began pouring champagne. Madison's laughter rang out near the center of the crowd, bright, effortless. She was surrounded by friends, people from her world, people who had never looked at me twice. The music quieted, and the soft chime of silver on glass pulled everyone's attention toward the podium. My father stood there tall and confident, a hand resting lightly on Evelyn's arm. The sunset framed them in gold. They looked like a photograph, picture-perfect, graceful, untouchable. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Richard began, his voice carrying easily through the speakers. "This day marks more than a union between Madison and Noah. It celebrates what truly holds us together, love and family." People nodded, smiling. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. When it reached me, it flickered, just for a heartbeat, but then smoothed back into that same controlled warmth. "Family," he continued, "isn't about circumstance or proximity. It's about blood, shared values, shared legacy." He raised his glass higher. "Tonight, let's toast to true family, the ones who carry that bond in their veins through every generation." Applause rose around him like a wave. I could feel the heat climb up my neck. My fingers tightened around my glass. Evelyn leaned into the microphone, her diamond bracelet catching the light. And to the ones who remind us, she added, smiling sweetly, that nothing is stronger than what you're born into. Blood is a gift, after all. It can't be replaced. The words slid through me like a blade, sharp, deliberate, and followed by the sting of laughter. Across the terrace, a woman in pearls leaned toward her husband. "That's the adopted one, isn't it?" she whispered. He nodded, chuckling softly. I brought the glass to my lips, my hand steady, even though I could feel my pulse in my throat. The champagne tasted bitter. My jaw ached from holding the smile. Beside me, Aunt Claire placed her hand gently over mine. "Don't," she whispered. "They want to see you react. You're stronger than they are." I nodded without looking at her. My eyes stayed on the horizon where the sun was half swallowed by the sea. The air had cooled, carrying the faint scent of ocean spray and expensive perfume. Inside my head, everything blurred, memories colliding, old wounds tearing open. The day Evelyn told me not to call her mom in public. The Christmas they sent Madison on a ski trip while I stayed behind with the housekeeper. The way my father once said, "You should be grateful we gave you a life." Funny how a few words said into a microphone and wrapped in champagne bubbles could cut deeper than any argument ever had. The applause faded, replaced by polite chatter. I set my glass down on the table beside me and stepped back out of the crowd. The air outside the tent was cooler, calmer. I could hear the ocean better from there. Steady, indifferent, infinite. I stood alone for a few minutes watching the waves and the flicker of candlelight from the reception area. My reflection shimmered faintly in the glass railing. I looked composed, almost regal, like someone who wasn't breaking inside. A voice called softly behind me. "Lauren." It was Madison. She was holding the hem of her dress in one hand, her makeup slightly smudged from the wind. "Hey," she said, breathless. "I didn't know you were coming. I wasn't invited." I said simply. Her smile faltered. "I didn't handle that. Mom said she stopped herself, realizing how that sounded. "I'm glad you're here." I nodded. "You look beautiful." She reached for my hand, hesitant. "Please don't let what they said ruin tonight. They didn't mean it the way it sounded. Madison." I said quietly, meeting her eyes. They meant exactly what it sounded like. Her lips parted, but no words came. The band started playing again, a low hum of saxophone and piano filling the silence between us. I could see the confusion in her eyes, the tug of war between loyalty and shame. She squeezed my hand before letting go. "I'll come find you later," she said, and walked back toward the light. The music, the laughter. I turned toward the sea again. The last edge of the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a thin red line that looked almost like a scar. In the distance, I could still hear my father's voice, echoing in the microphone. True family, shared blood. And for the first time, I realized he wasn't just excluding me. He was warning me. The wind picked up cold against my skin. I stayed there until the lights blurred and the sound of the ocean drowned everything else out. Then I turned and walked slowly back toward the reception, ready to face whatever came next. By the time the reception moved indoors, the sun was gone, and the lights from the chandeliers glittered like liquid gold over the tables. Jazz had been replaced by pop. The volume turned up just enough to drown out small talk. Everything gleamed, the glassware, the sequined dresses, the fake smiles. I stood at the bar, one hand around a glass of Sauvignon Blanc, watching my parents float from group to group. Richard laughed loudly at something a board member said, his hand resting on Evelyn's back in a rehearsed gesture of affection. Evelyn tilted her head, listening with that perfect mix of attention and superiority she had perfected over the years. They looked like an ad for success. If you didn't know better, you'd think they'd earned it. A waiter brushed past, asking if I wanted another drink. "Not yet," I said. The wine was sharp citrusy, but I barely tasted it. "Lauren." I turned to find Madison standing a few feet away. Her makeup had softened after the ceremony hair pulled back loosely. There was a tension in her shoulders, like she'd been holding her breath since sunset. "Hey," I said quietly. She hesitated before stepping closer. "I'm sorry." She began, her voice trembling a little. "I didn't know they didn't invite you." I met her eyes, and for once I didn't feel anger. Just something heavier, quieter. "It's all right," I said. "I came for you, not for them." Madison's eyes glistened. "They told me you'd make things uncomfortable, that you'd try to make the night about yourself." She winced at her own words. I believed them. "I'm so sorry." I smiled faintly. "Don't be. They've been rewriting the truth for years. It's easy to believe them when they say it with confidence." She exhaled shakily, then nodded. "You look good," she said, her attempt at small talk almost tender. "Thanks. You do too." Before either of us could say more, a man in a black suit approached Richard discreetly. I didn't catch the first few words, but I saw Richard's smile falter. He motioned for the man to follow him toward a quieter corner near the bar. That was when I noticed the name tag Wallace. Venue manager. The band played something upbeat, but the moment stretched in silence between us. I could see the tension tightening Richard's shoulders. Wallace leaned in, speaking quietly, but I caught a few words anyway. System. Declined. Balance due. Richard's face drained of color. Evelyn kept her back to him, laughing with a group of donors, but I saw her glance toward him once, sharp and questioning. He gave her a forced smile and an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Madison followed my gaze. "What's going on?" I took a sip of wine. "Looks like the show's starting to crack." Richard's tone rose slightly as he whispered to Wallace, who looked uncomfortable. Then he reached for his phone, pressed it to his ear. and muttered something I couldn't hear. When he hung up, Wallace tried again. Mr. Bennett. I'm sorry, but the system declined both cards. We'll need another form of payment for the remaining balance. 25,000. My father's composure fractured just enough for me to see the panic underneath. He glanced around, lowering his voice. Not here. Not now. I'll handle it in the morning. I'm afraid our policy requires payment before the end of the event, Wallace said, politely but firmly. I can run the card again if you'd like. Try again, Richard hissed. Evelyn drifted closer, still smiling at her guests while whispering through her teeth. What is it? Richard didn't answer. He waved at Wallace again, jaw tightening. The third attempt took longer. I could see the little green light on the card reader blink, then turn red. Wallace frowned slightly. I'm sorry, sir. Declined again. The sound of the machine seemed louder than the music. Across the room, I heard a waiter murmur to another. The card didn't go through. The words spread like perfume, soft, invisible, but everyone eventually noticed. Evelyn's hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her bracelet. Call the accountant, she whispered. Have them authorize the payment. Richard's reply was clipped. It's after hours. Her smile stayed fixed. You can't let anyone see this. Too late. I caught Aunt Claire's eyes from across the room. She knew something was unraveling. She could read it in the air. She gave me a small nod, the kind of nod that said, Don't interfere. Just watch. I did. Richard pulled Wallace aside, lowering his voice again, but the desperation in his tone was unmistakable now. Run it under the corporate account, I heard him say. I already tried, Sir Wallace replied. That one was declined first. My father's face tightened, a flicker of fury and humiliation mixing beneath his polished exterior. Evelyn placed a hand on his arm, whispering something like a prayer. From where I stood, I could see her knuckles whitening around her clutch. Around them, laughter continued. The music swelled. The illusion of perfection still held, barely. I set my empty glass on the bar and watched as the manager retreated for a moment, leaving Richard and Evelyn frozen in place. Madison had gone pale. What's happening? She asked quietly. Reality. I said, It's finally catching up. She blinked, startled by the sharpness in my tone. Lauren, don't. I'm not doing anything. I interrupted. For once, I don't have to. The band shifted into another song, but the melody blurred. From where I stood, the whole scene felt like watching a painting melt. Smiles slipping, laughter cracking, gold edges curling away. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, his signature gesture when he needed control. Evelyn touched his arm again. Fix it, she murmured, before anyone else finds out. I can't, he said under his breath. I caught only fragments of what came next. Words like balance policy embarrassment, and then silence heavy and suffocating, the kind that comes when even the ocean outside seems to hold its breath. A waiter passed behind me, muttering to another. They're saying the card's maxed out. Aunt Claire's voice echoed in my head. Let them see what truth looks like. I didn't move. Not yet. Richard straightened his jacket, pretending nothing had happened, and turned back to his guests. Everything's fine, he told Evelyn, though his jaw was rigid. We'll sort it out. Evelyn smiled, her brittle smile, the one she wore like armor. Of course we will, she said. But her eyes darted toward me, and for the first time that night, I saw something other than contempt there. I saw fear. The kind of fear that comes when the mask starts to slip, and you realize the person you erased from the picture is still standing in the room. Watching, waiting, and very much alive. The music cut off mid-song, the sound of the speakers humming like an exposed wire. A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd, first whispers, then low murmurs, then the unmistakable silence of people sensing a shift in power. The waitstaff froze near the bar, unsure whether to keep serving. Mr. Wallace stepped forward, holding a slim black folder. His voice was calm but firm. Mr. Bennett. I'm sorry, but we've tried multiple times. The system keeps declining. Unless another form of payment is provided, we'll need to pause service until it's resolved. The color drained from my father's face. For the first time that night, the polished charm he wore like armor began to crack. Evelyn turned sharply, her lips still frozen in a smile for the guests behind her. That's impossible, she said, her voice higher than usual. There must be a mistake. Try again. Wallace nodded politely and swiped the card again. The terminal blinked, beeped, and flashed red. Declined. The sound was quiet, but carried like thunder. My father muttered something under his breath. The manager's expression stayed neutral, the way people in service jobs master the art of quiet witnessing. Guests began glancing toward the commotion. Someone near me whispered, "What's happening?" Another voice answered, "I think his card got declined." I stood still, my glass forgotten in my hand. For the first time all evening, my father's eyes found mine. They flickered with something I couldn't name. Anger, humiliation, desperation. He walked toward me, shoulders squared, voice low. "Lauren," he said too softly for anyone else to hear. "You have a card, don't you?" "Just a temporary issue with the bank. I'll wire you back tomorrow." I stared at him, the man who had told 100 dinner guests that blood was the only thing that mattered. "You want me to help?" I asked, my tone even. He clenched his jaw. "Yes, this isn't the time for pride." "No," I said quietly. "It's exactly the time for pride." Evelyn appeared at his side, her voice sugar-coated panic. "Lauren, darling, please. You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I cut in. "You've spent your lives preaching about family legacy bloodlines, but when the bill comes due, suddenly the adopted daughter is family enough to pay." Her eyes widened. "Keep your voice down," she hissed. "I'm not raising it." The guests nearby had started watching openly now. Their murmurs felt like waves breaking against my back. Richard's composure snapped. "Lauren," he said through his teeth. "You're making a scene." I stepped closer, lowering my voice until it was almost a whisper. "No, Dad. I'm just making the picture clearer." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then my father's hand trembled as he held out the folder. "Please," he said, the words small foreign on his tongue. "Just take care of it. We'll talk later." I took the folder and opened it. The receipt inside gleamed under the chandelier. Balance due $25,000. My pulse slowed. My voice was calm. "All right. But remember, this is the last time I save you from yourselves." I walked past them, heels clicking on the marble floor, and stopped in front of Mr. Wallace. "Run the charge on my card," I said. He hesitated. "Are you sure, Ms. Bennett?" "Yes," I said. "It's just money." He nodded, swiped my card, and after a long pause, the terminal beeped green. Approved. The sound was sharp final. A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Someone near the bar whispered, "That's ironic. The uninvited one pays the bill." Another laughed under their breath. Mr. Wallace handed me the receipt. "Payment approved." "Thank you, Ms. Bennett." I signed it, then turned to face the room. My father and Evelyn stood frozen, their practiced smiles long gone. I met their eyes, letting the silence stretch until it felt heavy enough to crush the air. "Well," I said softly, "I guess the perfect family. Just got a little help from the imperfect part." Richard's mouth twitched. Evelyn looked down, her fingers gripping her clutch so hard, her knuckles turned white. I placed the pen on the counter, straightened my posture, and looked around. "You can turn the music back on," I said, to no one in particular. The band hesitated, then picked up the next song, something slow and polite, too fragile to fill the tension in the air. As I walked through the crowd, eyes followed me, some pitying, some impressed, others simply curious. Madison stood near the dance floor, tears glinting in the corners of her eyes. She didn't speak, but the look on her face said everything. Apology, awe, and something like love. I gave her a small nod and kept walking toward the exit. Each step felt deliberate, measured, like the only way to keep from shaking. Behind me, the murmur of voices grew louder. "Did you see that 25,000? The adopted one." My father didn't move. My mother tried to resume conversation with a nearby couple, but her voice broke on the first word. The illusion of control had slipped from her hands, and there was nothing left to grab. At the door, I paused just long enough to take one last look at the room. The glittering tables, the empty smiles, the stage where my father had toasted true family. Now he stood small under the chandelier shoulders, bowed eyes fixed on the floor. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel invisible. I stepped out onto the terrace. The night air hit me like a tide, cool and sharp with salt. I breathed in deeply, closed my eyes and let the noise of the party fade behind me. Somewhere inside, the music started again as if pretending nothing had happened. But I knew better. The cracks had finally shown and they would never vanish again. The wind whipped against my hair. and for a fleeting second I almost smiled, because for once they had needed me, and that truth would echo louder than any toast they could ever make. The terrace had gone eerily quiet. The hum of conversation, the clinking glasses, even the music had dissolved into the background, leaving only the ocean breathing below us. I could hear the surf crashing against the rocks in slow, steady rhythm, as if mocking the awkward silence hanging in the air. The chandelier light from inside the ballroom spilled faintly through the glass doors, turning the marble floor around me a soft gold. Mr. Wallace cleared his throat gently. "Everything's been taken care of," he announced, his tone polite but laced with something sharper. "The event can continue." His words landed like stones dropped into still water. The room didn't relax. If anything, the tension seemed to pulse harder. Guests began whispering behind their hands. I caught pieces of their murmurs, threads of judgment weaving together. They really let her pay the adopted daughter. That's unbelievable. I heard she wasn't even invited. A woman's voice cut through the whispers, low, indignant. "Letting your daughter pick up your bill." "That's shameful." Mr. Wallace bowed his head slightly toward me, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and disappeared back toward the kitchen. Madison's heels clicked hurriedly against the tile as she came toward me. Her face was pale, her eyes red around the edges. She didn't say anything at first, just threw her arms around me. The suddenness of it almost knocked the breath from my chest. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know this would happen. I swear if I'd known." I pulled back just enough to look at her. "Hey," I said softly. "Don't apologize for them. Just remember what you saw tonight." Her lips trembled. "You didn't deserve that. None of it. Maybe not." I said, "But I'm done expecting anything different." I glanced across the room and found Aunt Claire near the back. She didn't move toward us, but when our eyes met, she gave me a small, steady nod. A quiet kind of pride. The kind only people who've survived similar pain can offer. Behind us, Richard tried to reclaim control. "Well," he said, loudly lifting his glass. "Let's get the music going again, shall we?" His voice was brittle, cracking slightly at the edges. Evelyn stood beside him, her smile thin as glass knuckles, white around her clutch. The guests looked at one another, uncertain whether to follow his lead. Eventually, someone laughed nervously too loud, and the band struck up a song again, something upbeat that only made the silence underneath it feel heavier. As I made my way toward the exit, I passed by my parents. Richard's jaw was locked tight. His eyes flickered between me and the guests like he was calculating how much damage control would cost him. Evelyn couldn't quite meet my gaze. I stopped in front of them, my voice low enough that only they could hear. "The perfect family." I said, "Just got rescued by the one you didn't invite." Richard opened his mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to defend himself. But then he caught sight of the faces watching him. He shut it again and forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Evelyn's lips parted, but nothing came out. She stared at the floor, her composure dissolving like sugar in water. I didn't wait for a response. I turned my heels, echoing softly as I crossed the floor. The whispers grew quieter behind me. I pushed open the terrace door and stepped into the night. The cold air hit like a slap, clean and briny. The ocean stretched below, dark and endless, the moonlight scattering across its surface. My dress fluttered around my legs as I walked toward the edge of the terrace, gripping the railing. For the first time that night, I let myself breathe. Really breathe. Inside, the party sputtered back to life. Music playing, waiters pouring champagne again. Laughter resurfacing, but thinner now, forced. It sounded like glass cracking. I could picture my father at the bar refilling his drink, pretending not to care, while every person there replayed the scene in their heads, the great Richard Bennett, undone by a declined card, and the daughter he'd tried to erase. Evelyn would be doing damage control already, smiling too brightly, assuring everyone it was just a banking error. But they all knew. Everyone did. I leaned on the railing, staring at the waves below. My reflection shimmered faintly in the glass, steady despite the wind. For years, I thought revenge meant screaming until someone finally heard you. Tonight, I learned silence cuts deeper. The calm after humiliation is the kind of quiet that makes people tremble. Because they don't know what you'll do next. The terrace door opened behind me. Madison stepped out, her hair slightly undone, mascara smudged at the corners of her eyes. She stood beside me without saying anything. We both watched the water for a while. "They're acting like nothing happened," she said finally. "They always do," I replied, her voice cracked. "You shouldn't have had to fix their mess. I didn't do it for them." She looked at me, then confused. Then why I turned toward her, because walking away before the bill was paid would have made me like them. Madison blinked back, tears nodding. "I'll never forget what you did tonight. You don't have to," I said. "Just don't repeat it." She gave a small, shaky laugh. "You always were the strong one." I didn't answer. I wasn't sure strong was the right word. Maybe tired fit better. We stood there a little longer, two silhouettes against the Pacific. The wind whipped through the palm trees, and the sound of it almost drowned out the music inside. Almost. When Madison finally went back in, I stayed. The ocean moved endlessly beneath me, its rhythm patient, merciless, eternal. I thought about my father, about the way he looked at me when he realized he'd have to ask for help. The power dynamic had shifted forever, and he knew it. For the first time in my life, he needed me, and that truth would haunt him more than any words I could ever say. I turned my face toward the wind and closed my eyes. The night air was cold, sharp, alive. Behind me, laughter rose again, brittle and false. I didn't have to look to know my father was drinking harder now that Evelyn was pretending to enjoy a conversation she wasn't hearing. They'd remember tonight every time they raised a glass. And that was enough. The headline hit before sunrise. My phone lit up on the nightstand, vibrating against the wood, but I didn't check it right away. I already had a feeling. By the time I reached for it, every local news outlet in Newport had picked up the story. Bennett Foundation under IRS review. Source alleges misuse of charitable funds. Below the headline was a single line that made my stomach tighten. An anonymous donor claims a $25,000 charge at the Solana Resort was improperly billed to the foundation's account. I didn't need to guess who the anonymous donor was. Across the state in that sprawling oceanfront house with glass walls and marble floors, I knew my father would be pacing. Richard Bennett didn't handle exposure well. He probably read the same article, jaw-clenched, coffee untouched. Evelyn. I imagined standing beside him in her silk robe, pretending not to panic. By 7, my phone buzzed again. This time, Olivia. "You've seen the news," she said the second I answered. "Yeah," I said, pulling my laptop open. Her voice was tight but tinged with amusement. "Tell me this isn't karma in its purest form." I sighed. "I'm not celebrating it." "Oh, come on. They spent years parading that foundation as their moral crown jewel, and now, bam, front page for tax misuse. You can't tell me you're not at least a little satisfied." "I'm not surprised," I said. "That's as far as I'll go." There was a pause. Olivia lowered her voice. "You know they'll try to spin it. They always do. I know." I closed my eyes for a moment. The glow of the screen blurred. For years, the Bennett Foundation had been their fortress, restoring hope, investing in community. Their slogans, their lifelines. They'd raised millions for causes they barely cared about, all while collecting social capital like currency. I'd been the poster child once, the adopted daughter whose story inspired generosity. And now, that same story was their undoing. Somewhere in Newport, my father's phone began to ring, over and over. I imagined him sitting at the breakfast table surrounded by chaos. The housekeeper hovering by the door. Evelyn staring at the tablet in her hands, pale and tight-lipped. "Richard," she'd say, voice shaking. They found out. He'd slam his fist on the table. Who leaked this? Who the hell leaked this? The sound of another call coming in, overlapping the last. The foundation's board, the donors, the press, all demanding answers. "Turn it off." He'd snap. Evelyn trembling now. "You used the foundation card, didn't you? You told me you'd cover it personally. It doesn't matter who paid." He'd shout back. "It's the same family account." Her eyes would harden. Realization dawning like ice. "No, Richard. It's fraud." The memory of his voice from the night before echoed through my head. Family means blood, shared values, shared legacy. I wondered what legacy looked like under federal investigation. By mid-morning, I was at my office in downtown Seattle. The air smelled like coffee and printer ink, the space filled with muted chatter from my team. Olivia leaned against my desk, scrolling through headlines. They're already camped outside your parents' house, she said. It's on Channel 4 now. I pretended to focus on the sketches in front of me. I didn't think it would move this fast. Scandals always do, especially when rich people try to cover them. Before I could answer, my phone rang again. An unfamiliar number from Washington, D.C. I hesitated, then answered. Ms. Bennett, a deep voice said. This is Detective Harris from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. My spine straightened. Yes, I'm calling regarding a payment you made last night at the Solana Resort. Can you confirm that the $25,000 charge was made with your personal card? Yes. I said. It was mine. I was a guest at the event. I covered the bill when the hosts couldn't. And the hosts were Richard and Evelyn Bennett, yes. A pause. I could hear papers shuffling on the other end. I appreciate your clarification. I should inform you, Ms. Bennett, that this payment triggered an automatic audit flag because the resort processed it under the Bennett Foundation's booking account. It's likely an internal error, but it's open to broader review. I understand, I said, keeping my voice steady. You're not under investigation, he added quickly. But your cooperation may be required if the Foundation's financial records show irregularities. That won't be a problem. I said, You'll find I keep my receipts. He exhaled, relieved. Good. We may be in touch again soon. When I hung up, Olivia was watching me. IRS. Yeah. Her eyes widened. Holy hell. They just want to confirm my end, I said. It's not about me. No, she said slowly. It's about them. By late afternoon, my phone had stopped buzzing. The calm after the storm. I buried myself in work, sketching layouts for a new client's office space. Clean lines, natural light glass walls. Everything my childhood home had, but none of the poison. When I left the office that evening, the sky over Seattle was streaked pink and gray. I walked along the waterfront, letting the cold air sting my face. I didn't check the news again until I got home. When I did, the photos were everywhere. Richard outside his house, flanked by reporters, his jaw tight, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. Evelyn at his side, smiling too brightly, every muscle in her face working to hold the facade together. Mr. Bennett. One reporter shouted, Is it true your daughter paid the bill? He ignored it, pushing past them. Mrs. Bennett, another called. Can you confirm the Foundation used donor funds for your daughter's wedding event? Evelyn turned just enough to face the cameras. Our family has no comment, she said evenly. We're cooperating fully with any review. That's all for now. Her voice cracked slightly on family. I stared at the footage on my laptop, the volume low, the screen glowing in the dark. My reflection overlapped with theirs. Same name, same blood on paper, but worlds apart. The irony wasn't lost on me. One bill. That's all it took. $25,000 to buy the truth that had been hiding behind charity galas and glossy magazine spreads for a decade. Outside the city, lights reflected off the water like 1,000 small lies dissolving at last. The truth doesn't shout. It just waits for the right moment to show its face, and sometimes all it needs is a receipt. 2 weeks later, the storm had started to fade from the headlines, but not from people's memories. I could still feel its shadow every time I opened my email, or heard someone whisper the name Bennett in a half-laugh, half-gasp. The Foundation had frozen its accounts. The donors had withdrawn. My father's picture had appeared on 3 different news outlets with the caption, Under Federal Review. By then, I'd stopped checking. The scandal wasn't my burden to carry anymore. It was a Tuesday morning. My office was quiet except for the faint hum of computers and the steady scratch of pencils over drafting paper. I was reorganizing client folders when my assistant poked her head through the door. Lauren, she said hesitantly. There's a woman here asking to see you. She says she's your mother. The pencil in my hand paused. Did she give a name? She said, Evelyn. I inhaled slowly. Send her in. A moment later, my mother stepped into the office. She looked smaller somehow, her posture bent by exhaustion instead of pride. Gone were the tailored suits, the pearls, the carefully arranged hair. She wore a simple beige coat and flats. Her face was bare pale, her eyes ringed with the purple shadows of sleeplessness. For a second, neither of us spoke. Lauren, she said quietly. Her voice didn't carry the command it used to. It trembled like paper. Please, I said, motioning to the chair across from me. Sit. She lowered herself carefully, her hands folded in her lap like she was afraid to touch anything. I know I'm probably the last person you want to see, she began, but I didn't know where else to go. You could try your husband. I said, my tone steady, professional. Her mouth tightened. Richard's not taking my calls. He's blaming me for everything. He says I handled the accounts, that I... Her voice broke off. He's trying to make me the scapegoat. I didn't answer right away. I poured a glass of water from the carafe on the table and set it in front of her. She didn't take it. I didn't know things would go this far, she said, finally. The media, the investigation. I thought it would blow over. I looked at her. You knew what he was doing. Her gaze flickered to the window. I didn't want to lose him, she said softly. Everything we built. Everything people thought we were. It was all I had left. And when you saw him humiliate me, I asked, when he stood there and toasted true family, what was that, Evelyn? Another thing you didn't want to lose. Her lips trembled. I thought if I stayed quiet, it would keep the peace. But that night when you paid that bill, she trailed off, wiping at her eyes. I realized you were the only person in that room who still had any dignity. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. I don't need your apology. You just need to stop pretending silence is the same as goodness. She nodded, tears streaking her face now. You're right. I was a coward. I hid behind what people thought of me, and I let Richard treat you like an accessory instead of a daughter. For the first time, she reached for the water. Her hands shook as she lifted it to her lips. I came to tell you, she continued. I'm leaving Newport. The house is on the market. The foundation's finished. I'm done being Mrs. Bennett. I want to start somewhere else. Somewhere no one knows my name. I studied her. She wasn't lying. At least, not in that moment. I could see the truth of it in her eyes. The weight of years finally pressing down the hollow realization that she'd traded her soul for status. Where will you go? I asked quietly. Maybe Oregon. I still have family near Bend. I just need to breathe again. I nodded once. Then go. But this time you pay your own way. She gave a broken laugh through the tears. I deserve that. When she stood to leave, I rose too. For a second, she looked at me like she wanted to hug me, like she thought maybe she still had the right. But she didn't move. I'm proud of you, she said instead, her voice small. I know I have no right to be, but I am. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I hope you find peace, Evelyn. But you're going to have to earn it this time. She nodded slowly, pressing a tissue to her lips. Goodbye, Lauren. I watched her walk to the door, her shoulders slightly hunched. She hesitated for half a second before opening it like she was waiting for me to say something that might undo the years between us. But I didn't. When the door closed behind her, the room felt impossibly still. Through the window, Seattle's skyline shimmered against the gray afternoon. I sat back at my desk, staring at the empty chair where she'd been sitting. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, all I felt was tired. In some quiet corner of my chest, beneath the layers of resentment and self-control, a small ache pulsed, something like pity or maybe grief for the mother I'd never really had. Outside, a light rain began to fall soft against the glass. I turned my chair toward it and watched the droplets slide down the window, each one catching the gray light before disappearing. For the first time in years, I didn't feel angry. Just done. It was a gray afternoon in late October when the knock came at my door. I'd just finished a client call and was half listening to the rain against the windows when I heard it. A soft, hesitant sound like someone testing whether they were welcome. When I opened the door, Madison stood there, her eyes red and swollen, clutching a thick envelope. She looked smaller than I remembered the confident smile she wore at her wedding long gone. Hey, I said softly. She didn't smile. Her voice cracked when she spoke. I'm divorced. The word hung in the air like fog. She held up the envelope slightly. The papers came through this morning. I stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. You want tea? Anything warm, she whispered. She followed me into the kitchen, moving like someone who hadn't slept in days. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove. The silence between us was heavy, but not hostile. More like the quiet, after a long argument no one won. When the water boiled, I poured 2 mugs and handed one to her. Her hands trembled slightly as she took it. Noah found out, she said, finally, staring into the steam. About the foundation. About the accounts. I leaned against the counter. What did he say? He asked me to choose. She said, between him and our family. I waited. I tried to explain. She went on, her voice breaking. Tried to tell him it wasn't that simple, that I couldn't just turn on them, but He said if I stayed silent, I was complicit. And he was right. She blinked hard, wiping tears before they fell. I couldn't lie anymore. I packed a bag and left the next morning. The kettle clicked softly behind us. I took her mug, refilled it, then sat across from her at the small kitchen table. You did the right thing, I said. Madison laughed weakly. That's what people say when you lose everything. You didn't lose everything, I said. You finally stopped pretending. Her eyes met mine, glassy but fierce. I used to think you were cold, she said. That you didn't care about anyone but yourself. But I was wrong. You were just stronger than all of us. The words hit harder than I expected. I didn't reply. I just reached over and squeezed her hand. After a while, I stood and started dinner. Nothing fancy. Pasta, a salad, garlic bread from the bakery downstairs. Madison offered to help, but I shook my head. You've had enough of people telling you what to do. Sit. She smiled for the first time. It was small, but real. We ate later on the balcony. The rain had stopped, and the Seattle skyline glowed against the damp night. The city always looked cleaner after a storm like it had been forgiven. Madison pushed her plate aside. I sent everything to the IRS this morning, she said quietly. Bank statements, transactions, internal emails. I told them I couldn't stay silent anymore. I set my fork down. That's brave. She gave a half laugh. It doesn't feel brave. It feels like betrayal. It's not. I said, it's the first honest thing you've done in years. She looked at me then, really looked. Dad's going to hate me for this. He already hates anything he can't control, I said. You're just the newest reminder. The wind picked up, carrying the faint smell of rain and coffee from the street below. Madison tucked her knees to her chest, her voice small. I'm scared, Lauren. I know, I said, but fear's just the first step before freedom. We sat there for a long time, neither of us talking, the sound of the city filling the quiet. Later, when the plates were cleared and the lights dimmed, she curled up on my couch, wrapped in a blanket that still smelled faintly of lavender detergent. I brought her a glass of water and set it on the coffee table. You can stay here as long as you need, I said. She nodded sleepily. Thank you. I sat in the armchair across the room, watching her drift off. The tension in her face softened in sleep the same way it had when she was a kid, and used to sneak into my room during thunderstorms. Back then I'd pretend to be annoyed, but truthfully I liked it, having someone close who didn't expect me to perform. When she finally fell asleep, I turned off the lamp and stood by the window. The city lights shimmered in the reflection of the glass, merging with her sleeping form behind me. For years I'd told myself family was something you either had or didn't. Tonight I realized it could be something you built, choice by choice, truth by truth. I watched Madison breathe, her chest rising and falling, the storm outside replaced by something gentler, steadier. Maybe this was what peace looked like. Not forgiveness, not closure. Just two women who'd survived the same lie sitting quietly in its aftermath. I leaned against the window, my reflection overlapping hers. Maybe this, I whispered to myself, is what family really means. The city hummed below, alive and unbothered, as if reminding me that even after the mess, life keeps moving forward. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was standing still. By the end of 2024, Los Angeles was drowning in winter rain, and every news station in the city seemed to be talking about the same thing, the Bennett trial. I hadn't planned to watch it, but that morning every cafe, every waiting room, every lobby had a screen tuned to it. Even the silence outside seemed to lean in toward the courthouse. The cameras flashed like lightning as my father stepped out of a black car, shielding his face with a hand that used to hold courtroom juries in awe. He still wore the tailored suit, the perfectly combed gray hair, the faint smile that said, I'm still in control. But I could see it, the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his shoulders hunched like the air itself was heavier now. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the benches, typing frantically. Evelyn sat in the second row, her posture perfect as ever, though her skin looked paper-thin, almost translucent under the fluorescent lights. Madison sat beside her face, drawn hands clasped tightly in her lap. I didn't go. I couldn't. Watching from my apartment in Seattle felt safer, like seeing the past through a window that couldn't be opened. The prosecutor's voice came steady, precise. Richard Bennett is charged with multiple counts of fraud, tax evasion, and misuse of charitable funds under the Bennett Foundation. We will show that Mr. Bennett knowingly redirected donations meant for children and families in need for personal expenses and social events, including the private wedding of his biological daughter, Madison Bennett. My breath caught when he said it like that. Biological daughter. The distinction still sliced like glass even after everything. The defense tried to paint it as oversight, a bookkeeping error, a misunderstanding between personal and foundation accounts. But there was too much paper, too many receipts, too much arrogance. Footage from the courtroom showed my father sitting still, jaw tight, eyes forward. Evelyn avoided his gaze completely. Madison didn't move at all. When the verdict came, it was quiet. Richard Bennett, guilty on multiple counts. His law license revoked. 2 years probation, a suspended sentence, and an order to repay over $500,000 in restitution. Evelyn Bennett, guilty of negligence and complicity, fined heavily, and banned from managing any non-profit organization for the next 10 years. The camera zoomed in on them as the judge dismissed the case. My father gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if accepting a business deal gone wrong. Evelyn's lips parted slightly, and for the first time she looked human. Reporters swarmed outside as the two of them exited the courthouse. Mr. Bennett, do you have anything to say to your donors? He ignored them. Mrs. Bennett, how do you respond to claims? Your adopted daughter exposed the foundation's fraud. Evelyn stopped just for a second. She looked at the reporters, at the swarm of microphones, at the faces that had once adored her at every charity gala. Then she said quietly, "Tell her, thank you. She did what we never had the courage to do." The clip played on every major network for 2 days. I saw it once, late at night, sound low, the glow of the TV washing over my apartment. Then I turned it off. I stood by the window, staring at the reflection of city lights trembling on the glass. Outside, wind whipped through the streets, making the trees sway against the glow of passing headlights. Justice, it turned out, didn't feel like victory. It felt like silence. The kind that settled when people who once filled every corner of your life finally stopped pretending they were right. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. My donation page was still up from the last project I'd completed, a fund for art programs in underprivileged schools. I hesitated for only a moment before typing in a new amount, $50,000. Under donor note, I wrote, from Lauren Bennett, a child once adopted for publicity. It felt strange to hit submit, cathartic but quiet, like laying flowers on a grave. I shut the laptop and leaned back, letting the sound of the rain fill the room. The next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Bennett family falls from grace. Charity power couple found guilty of fraud. And my favorite, the one that made Olivia text me a photo, with 3 exclamation points, the truth about the uninvited daughter who paid the price. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The story no longer belonged to me. It belonged to the people who'd once used me to build theirs. That evening, I went for a walk by the waterfront. The air was cold, sharp with salt and mist. The wind tangled my hair, and the sound of the waves echoed faintly against the concrete. I stopped at the railing, staring out at the dark water. I thought about my father's face as he'd walked out of the courthouse, that look of disbelief that the world no longer revolved around him. I thought about Evelyn's voice, thin but sincere, and how long it must have taken her to find it. And I thought about Madison. Her courage, her honesty, her tears on my couch. For years I had chased the idea of justice, like it was something loud and dramatic. But now I realized it wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about the quiet reckoning that came when truth no longer needed to shout. Sometimes justice isn't about apologies or headlines. Sometimes it's about silence. The kind that follows when arrogance finally runs out of words. The wind picked up, carrying the faint smell of rain from the sound. I closed my eyes, breathing it in. The city lights reflected across the water, glittering like fragments of something once broken, now scattered but free. I turned back toward home, the rain starting again, soft, steady, and cleansing. Spring came early to Seattle that year. The city was awash in soft light and the smell of cherry blossoms from Volunteer Park. For the first time in a long time, the air didn't feel heavy. It felt like possibility. The new office was still half-empty, sunlight spilling across polished floors, and boxes labeled with client names. The sign on the glass door read Bennett & Co. Interiors, Seattle, Portland. Seeing it made me smile. Not because of the name, but because it finally meant something of my own. I walked slowly through the space, fingertips grazing the edges of desks, stacks of swatch books and models of rooms waiting to be built. My company had grown quietly in the shadow of everything else. Steady, self-made, untouched by the mess that once defined my last name. Madison had sent flowers that morning. A note tucked inside the bouquet read, "For the sister who taught me how to rebuild from truth." She was in Portland that week, preparing the opening of the Second Circle, the nonprofit we'd launched together, a community center for foster youth aging out of the system. It had taken almost a year of planning and more healing than either of us had expected. Around noon, my phone buzzed. A new message from Madison, a photo of her standing in front of the center's sign, ribbon-cutting scissors in hand, smile wide and bright. The caption beneath it read, "Family by choice." I felt something loosen inside me, the kind of quiet pride that didn't need an audience. On the wall beside my desk hung a wooden frame I'd had made last month. Inside was the receipt from the Solana Resort, creased, faded, but still legible. Amount paid $25,000. Beneath it, written in my handwriting on a strip of linen paper, were the words, "Paid in full. Freedom included." It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about proof. Proof that I had survived the worst of what they tried to make me believe, that I could build something whole from the pieces they left behind. I sat at my desk and looked out the window. The afternoon sun shimmered on the water, the reflection of the Space Needle just visible in the distance. Below, people walked dogs, jogged, lived their ordinary lives. Sometimes I thought about my parents. Richard was serving his probation somewhere in Southern California, working under another firm's name, stripped of his titles, but still clinging to the illusion of control. Evelyn had sold the Newport house and moved north somewhere quiet, somewhere she could start over without the Bennett legacy echoing down every street. We hadn't spoken since that day in my office, and I didn't know if we ever would. But Madison, she called every week, sometimes just to talk about nothing at all, recipes, furniture, the rain, other times to talk about something deeper, something that mattered. Once during one of those late-night calls, she said, "You know, I think you paying that bill was the best thing that ever happened to us." I laughed. "You have an odd definition of best." "I mean it," she said. "You ended the story we were all pretending to live." Maybe she was right. The office door opened then, and Olivia poked her head in. "You're still here?" she asked, holding 2 coffees. "Someone has to make sure this place doesn't collapse before the ribbon cutting," I said. She grinned, handing me one of the cups. "You've built something incredible, Lauren. You should enjoy it." I looked around. The light, the silence, the faint echo of the city outside. It all felt earned, I said. Finally. After she left, I stepped out onto the small balcony overlooking the water. The wind carried the scent of rain mixed with salt and spring blossoms. Boats glided silently across the Sound, their white sails catching the light. For a long while, I just stood there feeling the breeze against my skin. My life was quieter now, smaller maybe, but it was mine. Entirely mine. I thought about the night of the wedding. The laughter, the humiliation, the weight of that checkbook in my hand. I remembered my father's voice, smooth and certain. "To true family." And then my own, steady and calm. The perfect family just got rescued by the one you didn't invite. It felt like a lifetime ago. In the reflection of the office window, I caught my own eyes. They looked older, sharper, but softer too. The kind of eyes that had seen the worst and chosen to stay open anyway. I took one last sip of my coffee and whispered almost to myself. They called me the uninvited guest, but in the end, I was the only one who stayed. The wind picked up, scattering a few petals across the balcony floor. Somewhere inside, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Madison, a photo of kids laughing under the new center's mural. I smiled. Maybe that was the real ending. Not revenge, not justice. Just life continuing cleaner and truer than before. As the sun dipped lower, painting the city in gold, I turned back toward the open office, my name on the door, the framed receipt on the wall, and a future that no longer belonged to anyone else. If you've ever been made to feel like the outsider in your own family, remember this silence can be louder than anger, and dignity outlasts every insult. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is peace, and when you finally find it, you don't need an invitation.